I'm Arthur. If you learned about the Holocaust in school, you were most likely taught its shape, the trains, the fences, the iron gates of the camps, far away in occupied Poland. That shape is true, and it is terrible, and it is not the whole of it. Because before most of those camps were even running, there was another Holocaust. It did not arrive by train, it arrived on foot, at the edge of ordinary towns, and it was carried out with rifles, in daylight, in front of neighbors who knew the victims by name. In one country alone, it took roughly 1.5 million lives. That country is Ukraine, and by the reckoning of the major Holocaust institutions, 1 out of every 4 Jews murdered in the entire Holocaust was murdered there. Almost none of that was in my school books, and I suspect it was not in yours. And here is the part that has never let go of me. This story was buried twice, once by the men who did the killing, who came back later to dig up and burn what they had done. And then again, for nearly half a century, by the very state that had defeated them. Tonight we are going to unbury it, all of it, from the world that existed before, to the ravine outside Kyiv, to the long war over remembering. Pour yourself something warm and let the evening go quiet around you. We begin in a world that no longer exists. There is a map most of us carry in our heads when we hear the word Holocaust, and it is a map of Poland. Auschwitz sits at the center of it. Around Auschwitz, the other names we memorized: Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, the sealed trains moving across Europe toward them. On that mental map, the murder of the Jews of Europe is an industrial process, hidden behind fences, carried out at a distance from the world's eyes, discovered only when the camps were opened and the films were shown. But that map leaves out close to half the dead. By the middle of 1941, about 2.7 million Jews lived on the territory of what is now Ukraine. It was one of the great heartlands of Jewish life on earth, and it had been for centuries. 4 years later, historians estimate that around 1.5 million of them had been murdered. Not in death camps. Most of them never saw a train. They were shot in ravines and anti-tank ditches and forest clearings, usually within walking distance of the homes they had lived in all their lives. Scholars now call this the Holocaust by bullets, and it was the first phase of the Holocaust, not a footnote to it. When the officials of the German state sat down at a villa outside Berlin in January of 1942 to coordinate what they called the final solution, the shooting in the East had already been underway for half a year, and hundreds of thousands were already dead. The camps did not begin the Holocaust. In a very real sense, they industrialized a massacre that was already happening, town by town, in Ukraine. So why does the version taught in classrooms so rarely include it? Part of the answer is geography, because these killings happened in places Western journalists and Western armies never reached. Part of it is the nature of the crime itself, because a death camp leaves ruins, and ruins can be photographed, while a ravine grows over with grass. But the largest part of the answer is deliberate. The evidence was burned by the perpetrators in a secret operation near the end of the war, and after the war, the Soviet state that ruled Ukraine spent decades making sure the victims were not remembered as Jews at all, but dissolved into a vaguer category, peaceful Soviet citizens, until the specific thing that had happened to a specific people quietly disappeared from the record. Before we walk into it, one word about the number itself: 1.5 million, because numbers like that have a way of sliding off the mind without leaving a mark. Psychologists say we cannot truly picture a million of anything, and the murderers counted on exactly that failure of imagination, both while they killed and afterward. So here is another way to hold it. Imagine that every single person in a city the size of Philadelphia, every adult, every child, every infant, disappeared over about 30 months. Or take it smaller. The number means that on an average day across those years, well over 1,000 people were shot before sundown, day after day after day, for nearly 1,000 days. Each of them had a name, a face they saw in the mirror, a way they laughed. The entire method of this evening will be to keep pulling individual threads out of that number, because the number is the killer's way of telling the story, and the names are ours. That is the story of tonight. It runs from the last summer of an old world, through the two most terrible years in the history of this land, and then onward, decades past the war's end, because the fight over this memory did not end in 1945. In some ways it has not ended now. By the end of the evening, you will know what happened at a ravine called Babyn Yar, and at a fortress town called Kamianets-Podilskaya, and in a seaport called Odessa. You will know the names of a puppet theater actress who climbed out of a mass grave, a poet who broke a nation's silence with a single opening line, and a writer who escaped across the Iron Curtain with the truth sewn into the lining of his coat. And you will understand why, for 50 years, the largest of these crime scenes had no monument that dared to say who died there, but to feel the size of what was destroyed, you cannot start with the destruction. You have to start with the world that was. Close your eyes and picture a small market town somewhere between Kiev and the Carpathian Mountains, in the years before the First World War. It is Friday afternoon. The stalls are closing early. In the lanes off the square, women are carrying home bread and candles, and from the open windows comes the smell of cooking and the sound of 2 or 3 languages being spoken in the same breath, Yiddish and Ukrainian and Russian, braided together the way languages become braided when peoples have lived side by side for hundreds of years. This was the shtetl, the small Jewish market town, and the lands of Ukraine held thousands of them. Jews had lived on this territory for the better part of a millennium. Under the old Russian Empire, most Jews were legally confined to a western band of the empire known as the Pale of Settlement, and much of that band lay across what is now Ukraine. So the map of Jewish life and the map of Ukraine overlapped to an extraordinary degree. Odessa, the great port on the Black Sea, was one of the most Jewish cities in the world, a place of newspapers and theaters and famous wits, where by some counts 1/3 of the population was Jewish. Kiev had a Jewish community more than a century deep in the city's commerce and medicine and music. And the small towns, the Berdychevs and the Umans and the hundreds of places whose names are now known mostly from memorial books, were the soil out of which an enormous culture grew. It was a culture that gave the world more than it ever got credit for. The writer Sholem Aleichem, whose stories of Tevye the dairyman would much later become Fiddler on the Roof, was born in a town near Kiev called Pereyaslav, and he set his fictional worlds precisely here, in these lanes and market squares among these people. The stories the world knows as warm and funny are, among other things, a documentary record of this civilization. Golda Meir, who would one day lead the state of Israel, was born in Kiev in 1898, and her earliest memory, she wrote, was of her father boarding up the door against a rumored pogrom. Generations of American families, if they trace the thread back far enough, arrive in some small town in Ukraine whose name their great-grandparents carried across the ocean. This was also a world of scholars and printing houses, of Hasidic courts and rationalist yeshivas arguing with each other across the decades, of tailors and blacksmiths and water carriers, of enormous poverty and enormous vitality all at once. And Odessa deserves a moment of its own, because Odessa was not simply a city with Jews in it. Odessa was one of the capitals of the Jewish world. Its cafes and courtyards produced a whole school of writers and musicians. Its Jewish gangsters became literature. Cantors and violinists toured the world, and an extraordinary share of the great violin virtuosos of the 20th century trace back to its music schools. Jewish Odessa was famous for a particular tone, ironic, worldly, unimpressed by power, and that tone traveled wherever its emigrants went, to New York, to Tel Aviv, to Buenos Aires. When we reach October of 1941, remember what this city had been. It was never a safe world. It is important to say that honestly. The same centuries that built this culture were studded with catastrophes, waves of pogroms under the Tsars, and then, in the chaos after the First World War and the Russian Revolution, a storm of violence in which enormous numbers of Jews were killed across Ukraine by various armies, warlords, and peasant bands. Historians who have counted the pogroms of those Civil War years, 1918 to 1921, put the dead in the many tens of thousands, and some recent studies argue for 100,000 or more. It was, until the events we are approaching, the largest massacre of Jews in modern history, and it had happened on this same ground, within living memory, one single generation earlier. Every Jewish family in these lands carried memories of flight and fear, but they also carried something else, which mattered terribly in 1941. Many of the older generation carried a memory of the German army of the First World War as a comparatively orderly, comparatively decent occupying force, certainly gentler than some of the alternatives of that era.
Hold on to that detail. It will return, and it will break your heart. Then came the Soviet decades.
The revolution abolished the old legal restrictions, and for a time Jewish life in Soviet Ukraine went through a strange double movement, doors opening and doors closing at once. Jews could now live in the big cities, attend the universities, rise in the professions, and many did, moving from the shtetls into Kiev and Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk. For a while, the state even sponsored a secular Yiddish culture of its own, with state Yiddish schools, Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish theaters, a strange hothouse world of communist modernity conducted in the language of the shtetl. But at the same time, and increasingly as the years passed, the Soviet state was strangling the religious and communal core of Jewish life, closing synagogues, dissolving community institutions, arresting teachers, and resting teachers, and by the end of the 1930s, most of that sponsored Yiddish world was being dismantled too, making the old ways harder and harder to pass on. By the late 1930s, a generation of Soviet Jews had grown up urban, secular, Russian-speaking, and deeply woven into Soviet society. They were doctors, engineers, teachers, army officers. They thought of themselves, most of them, as Soviet citizens first. And then, in September of 1939, the map moved. Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland between them, and the Soviet Union annexed the regions of eastern Galicia and Volhynia, lands with an old, dense, deeply traditional Jewish population, including the great city of Lviv. Hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews also fled eastward into these territories, running from the Germans into the Soviet zone. So by the middle of 1941, the territory of today's Ukraine held that staggering figure, roughly 2.7 million Jews, one of the largest Jewish populations of any land on the planet. Old religious communities in the West that had barely changed in a century. New Soviet professionals in the eastern cities, refugees who had already run from Hitler once. Almost none of them knew what was coming. And in fairness, almost no one on earth did, because the thing that was coming had never existed before. There were rumors from occupied Poland, carried by the refugees, of ghettos and brutality and forced labor. Terrible things, but survivable things, or so it was possible to believe. The idea that a modern European state would send squads of men behind its own army with orders to shoot every Jewish man, woman, and child they could find, that idea was not yet thinkable. It became thinkable here. On the evening of June 21st, 1941, this world, with its markets and choirs and arguments and courtships, went to bed as it always had. It had, though no one in it knew, a few hours left. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest invasion in the history of warfare, more than 3 million German and Allied troops, and it was, from its very conception, not a normal war. The planning documents said so openly. This was to be a war of annihilation, aimed not just at defeating an army, but at destroying a state and remaking the population map of Eastern Europe. The paperwork of that intention survives too. In the months before the attack, the German High Command issued orders that stripped the coming campaign of the ordinary laws of war in advance, directing that Soviet political officers taken prisoner were to be shot, and that crimes committed by German soldiers against Soviet civilians would, as a matter of policy, not be prosecuted. Soldiers were told, in writing, before a single shot had been fired, that this war was different, that this enemy was not to be treated as human beings had been treated in the wars their fathers fought. When the historians say the atrocities in the East were not excesses but policy, this is what they mean. The permission came first, the pits came after, and behind the front line, embedded in the invasion plan itself, came something the world had not seen before. 4 special task forces of the SS security services, called Einsatzgruppen, lettered A through D, followed the advancing armies with a mandate to secure the rear by eliminating those the regime considered its enemies. 2 of them, Einsatzgruppe C and Einsatzgruppe D, operated across Ukraine. All 4 groups together numbered only about 3,000 men. Remember that number, because it sits at the center of one of the hardest questions of this whole history. 3,000 men cannot murder well over 1 million people by themselves. They had help, and we will look at that honestly when we come to it. Who were these men? It would be easier, in a way, if they had been the monsters of a horror film, visibly deranged, drawn from some criminal underworld. The record shows something far more disturbing. The officer corps of the Einsatzgruppen was strikingly educated. Among the commanders were men with doctorates, trained lawyers, an economist, academics who had drifted through the German university system into the security services. These were men who could quote philosophy while organizing the destruction of a town's entire Jewish population, and who wrote up their work afterward in the dry, numbered language of bureaucratic reports sent back to Berlin. Consider the commander of Einsatzgruppe D, which operated in the far south of Ukraine and in Crimea, a man named Otto Ohlendorf. He was an economist by training, considered something of an intellectual within the SS, and under his command, by his own calm account, roughly 90,000 people were put to death in about a year. We know the number because he said it himself on the witness stand at Nuremberg, openly and without evasion. When his interrogators pressed him on the children, he explained the logic of killing them in the same measured voice, because children, he said, would grow up to be enemies. The horror of Ohlendorf is not madness. It is composure. The paper trail these units left behind is one of history's dark miracles of self-incrimination. Every few days, the groups radioed and mailed their results up the chain, and in Berlin the security services compiled them into numbered operational situation reports, hundreds of them across the war, copied and circulated to dozens of offices. Those reports survived, and they are among the most damning documents ever entered into a court record, because in them the murder of thousands of human beings is tallied as routinely as a company inventories its stock, town by town, date by date, column by column. In the first weeks, the shootings targeted mostly Jewish men of military age, under the pretext that they were potential partisans or Soviet functionaries. But through July and August of 1941, the orders widened, and the killing squads began to shoot women, then children. By late summer, the practice had hardened into a policy of total destruction. Entire communities, everyone, regardless of age. Historians still debate exactly when and how the formal decision crystallized, but the trajectory on the ground is beyond dispute. Every week, the circle of the Tanner, condemned, grew until it enclosed everyone born Jewish. Meanwhile, in the path of the advance, millions of ordinary people faced the most consequential decision of their lives, with almost no information: stay or flee. The Soviet state evacuated factories, officials, skilled workers, and their families eastward, and many Jews, especially younger city dwellers connected to industry or the party, got out with them. From Kyiv, whose Jewish population before the war was around 160,000, roughly 100,000 Jews fled or were evacuated east before the Germans arrived. That evacuation, chaotic and incomplete as it was, saved more Jewish lives in the Soviet Union than any other single factor. But think about who could not go. To flee, you needed a place on a train or a truck, or the strength to walk east for hundreds of miles under bombing. You needed to be young enough, healthy enough, unattached enough. The ones who stayed were disproportionately the elderly, the sick, women with small children, people with no connections and nowhere to go. And there was that other thing, the memory we set aside a chapter ago. Some of the old people remembered the Germans of 1918 as correct, even courteous occupiers, and they said so to their frightened children and grandchildren. The Bolsheviks had given them plenty of reasons for fear over the years. Perhaps, some reasoned, the Germans could be lived with, the way occupiers had been lived with before. Soviet newspapers before the invasion had said little about what Germany was doing to Jews, because until the day of the attack, Germany was officially a treaty partner. So families made their choices half blind. Some fled with nothing and survived. Some stayed to guard an apartment, or a sick mother, or a grave, and were lost. Across the whole occupied Soviet Union, the evacuation eastward would ultimately save well over 1 million Jewish lives, and survival for a Soviet Jew in 1941 very often came down to a single brutal variable, whether you were east or west of the front line on the day it passed you. There was no policy of rescue and no plan. There was a train you caught or did not catch. Through that summer, the front rolled east across Ukraine with terrifying speed. Lviv fell within the first week. By September, German forces were closing a gigantic encirclement around Kyiv itself, in one of the largest battles of the entire war, and the Red Army's defense of the city was collapsing. The killing squads were already at work behind the lines. But what happened in the very first days, in the western city of Lviv, deserves its own chapter, because it shows a dimension of this catastrophe that the tidy schoolbook version never touches at all. Lviv, in the far west of Ukraine, was one of the great cities of old Central Europe, a place of Baroque churches and coffee houses that had belonged to Austria, then to Poland, and had been Soviet for less than 2 years when the war began. Its Jewish community was one of the largest in the region, swollen further by refugees, and numbered well over 100,000. German troops entered Lviv on June 30th, 1941, the 9th day of the invasion. What they and the world found there first, though, was a Soviet crime. In the days before retreating, the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, had massacred the inmates of the prisons of the western regions rather than leave them behind. In Lviv and in dozens of other towns, thousands upon thousands of prisoners across western Ukraine, most of them Ukrainians and Poles, political prisoners of the Soviet annexation. In Lviv, the prison yards were opened in the summer heat. Families were brought in to search the rows of bodies for their sons and husbands, and the city convulsed with grief and rage. German propaganda companies filmed all of it, carefully, because a use for that rage had already been prepared. What happened next is one of the darkest turns in this entire history. German propaganda and agitators on the ground directed that rage at the city's Jews, resurrecting the old poisonous equation of Jews with Bolshevism, blaming them collectively for the NKVD's murders. In the first days of July, a pogrom swept Lviv. Jews were dragged from their homes into the streets, beaten, humiliated in public, forced to clear the bodies from the prisons, and killed. Militiamen organized by Ukrainian nationalist activists took part, and so did ordinary residents of the city, while German soldiers watched, photographed, encouraged, and joined the killing with organized shootings of their own. At the end of July it happened again, a second wave of street violence, days that the perpetrators themselves named after a Ukrainian national figure of the Civil War era, as if to dress the murder in the clothes of historical grievance. The estimates of the dead from that Lviv summer vary, as they always do in chaos, but historians place the toll of the pogroms and the accompanying Einsatzgruppen shootings in the range of 4,000 to perhaps 8,000 human beings in a single city in a matter of weeks. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story where honest history has to walk a narrow path. It would be false to say the local population as a whole rose against its Jewish neighbors. It would be equally false to pretend the violence was purely a German import, performed only by outsiders in uniform. Both things were true at once. There were locals who joined the mobs, and locals who hid Jews in their cellars that same week. The German invaders did not find a land of murderers. They found a land under unbearable pressure, seeded with old hatreds, fresh grievances, and terror, and they applied a match to it deliberately, because pogroms served their purposes. They wanted the killing to look spontaneous. They said so in their own reports. But mobs, from the German point of view, were inefficient. The future of the killing was not the mob, it was the schedule, the list, the cordon, the pit. And in the last days of August, in a fortress town in the southwest called Kamianets-Podilsky, that future arrived at a scale no one had yet imagined. The setup was grimly bureaucratic. Hungary, Germany's ally, had been expelling Jews it classified as foreign from its territory, pushing them over the border into the German-occupied zone. About 16,000 people deported into the region of Kamianets-Podilsky. The local German administration complained, in the language of logistics, that it could not feed or house them. The problem went up the chain to the higher SS and police leader for southern Russia, a man named Friedrich Jeckeln, and Jeckeln proposed to solve it completely. On August 27th and 28th, 1941, SS men, police units, and their helpers marched the deportees from Hungary together with much of the local Jewish population out of the town in long columns to pits prepared in advance. Over 2 days they shot, according to Jekyll's own report to Berlin, 23,600 people. It was the first massacre of the final solution to cross into 5 figures, the moment the murderers themselves learned that killing on that scale was possible, that their men would do it, that the logistics worked, that no one would stop them. Historians have called it a rehearsal, and the word is apt in the most chilling possible way. Something was tested at Kamianets-Podilsky, and the test, from the perpetrator's perspective, succeeded. A month later, the method was brought to the capital and to a ravine whose name would become the emblem of the entire Holocaust by bullets. German forces entered Kiev on September 19, 1941, after the encirclement battle had shattered the Soviet armies defending it. Perhaps 60,000 Jews remained in the city out of the pre-war 160,000, mostly those who could not leave, the old, the ill, women with children, people who had waited too long or trusted too much. 5 days after the occupation began, on September 24th, enormous explosions began tearing through Kreshtatik, the city's grand central street. Buildings housing German offices collapsed. Fires spread for days and left the heart of the city in ruins. The bombs had been planted before the retreat by the Soviet security services, radio-controlled mines left behind precisely to kill occupiers, a Soviet military operation by any definition. The Germans knew this, and it made no difference at all. Within days, the occupation command, the SS, and the leadership of Einsatzgruppe C had settled on a response that had nothing to do with the saboteurs and everything to do with the policy that had been building all summer. They would use the explosions as the pretext to kill the Jews of Kiev, all of them. At a meeting in the city, the plan was made, the site was chosen, and the machinery was set in motion with astonishing speed. On September 28th, notices appeared on walls and fences across Kiev, printed in Russian, Ukrainian, and German. All Jews of the city and its vicinity were ordered to report the next morning, Monday, September 29th, at 8 o'clock, at a street corner near the Jewish cemetery on the northwestern edge of town. They were told to bring their documents, money, valuables, and warm clothing. Anyone who disobeyed would be shot. Read that notice the way its readers had to read it, with no knowledge of what we know. Documents, valuables, warm clothes, a gathering point beside the railway lines. Nearly everyone drew the same conclusion, that this was a deportation, that they were being resettled somewhere, perhaps to labor, perhaps into some ghetto in the West. Hard, frightening, but survivable. The old assurances made the rounds. One more time, the Germans are a civilized people. Remember the last war. On the morning of the 29th, tens of thousands of people, whole families, grandmothers carrying bedding, mothers carrying infants, formed an enormous, slow column and walked, carrying their luggage, toward the meeting point. The crowd was so large that people stood in line for hours. The city was walking out of its own history, suitcases in hand. Witnesses who watched that column pass remembered details that stay with you precisely because they are so ordinary. People had dressed their children warmly, as instructed. Families loaded carts with the grandparents and the bundles. Neighbors stood on the sidewalks and watched, some weeping, some silent, a few calling out mockery, and the column moved on past them at a walking pace, through familiar streets, in the cool weather of late September. The destination was a place every Kievan knew, a huge branching ravine on the city's edge called Babyn Yar, in Russian Babyn Yar, a name that means something like the old woman's gully. Generations of children had played in it. It was about to become one of the largest mass graves in Europe. The system at the ravine was a machine built in a day, and I will describe it plainly and briefly without lingering, because you need to understand how it worked, and no one needs me to dwell. The column was funneled through a series of checkpoints. Past the last one, there was no return. In stages, people were made to give up their luggage, then their documents and valuables, then their outer clothing. Stripped of everything, they were driven in small groups through a gauntlet and down into the ravine, made to lie face down on the ground, or on those who had already been shot and were killed with rifle and machine gun fire by men of Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppe C, commanded by a colonel named Paul Blobel, working with police battalions, with local auxiliaries assisting in the cordons and the funneling. The shooting went on all day and resumed the next morning. The perpetrator's own paperwork records one more detail, and it may be the saddest sentence in the whole file. The organizers had expected, by their own admission, only 5,000 or 6,000 people to obey the notice. More than 5 times that number came. The report explains why, in one dry clause, the population had believed until the very end that they were being resettled. The victims' trust in the ordinary meaning of words, documents, valuables, warm clothing was itself part of the weapon. The unit's own report to Berlin, preserved and later read into the record at Nuremberg, states the result with the precision of a ledger. In 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941, 33,771 Jews were murdered at Babyn Yar. It stands among the largest single massacres of the entire Holocaust, and it was accomplished not in a hidden camp over months, but in a city suburb in 48 hours, within earshot of apartment blocks. People in the neighborhood heard the firing from morning to night. Everyone in Kiev knew within days. This was never a secret crime. It was a public one, and that fact will matter enormously when we come to the burning of the bodies and to the silence afterward. In the days that followed, the machinery of profit moved in behind the machinery of murder. The luggage that had been surrendered at the checkpoints, thousands upon thousands of suitcases and bundles, was sorted and hauled away. The emptied apartments of the dead were sealed, inventoried, and reassigned. Warm clothing was collected for the German war effort. This too was standard procedure everywhere the shootings happened, and it is part of why so many people in so many towns knew exactly what had occurred, because the physical evidence of it, the goods and rooms and garments of the murdered, flowed visibly back into the living city. And there was a boy watching all of it from close range. In the district beside the ravine lived a 12-year-old named Anatoly Kuznetsov, a Kiev kid, half Russian, half Ukrainian, not Jewish, hungry and sharp-eyed. From his own yard he heard the machine gun fire that September, day and night, and through the whole occupation he watched what the ravine became, and he began writing what he saw into a school notebook, in secret, simply because he understood, as children sometimes do more clearly than adults, that what he was seeing needed to be written down. Keep his name close. A quarter of a century later, that boy's notebook will detonate under the official silence like a delayed charge. A handful of people survived the ravine itself, and it is because of them that the world has eyewitness testimony from inside the machine. The most famous of them was a young woman named Dina Pronicheva, an actress with the Kiev Puppet Theater. At the edge of the pit, she jumped a fraction before the guns fired, fell among the bodies, and lay motionless for hours, feigning death while the killing continued above her, while soldiers walked the ravine finishing off the wounded. In the darkness, wounded in spirit beyond anything we can imagine but alive, she climbed the ravine wall and got out. She survived the rest of the occupation under a false identity, and after the war she did something almost as brave as surviving. She stood up in a courtroom in Kiev in January of 1946 and told it all. One of the very few living witnesses from inside any of the great shooting pits ever to testify. Her testimony and the killer's own tidy reports corroborate each other, the victim's memory and the murderer's arithmetic agreeing on the facts. In the weeks and months that followed, Babyn Yar did not close. The ravine became a permanent execution ground for the occupation, and beside it the Germans built the Siritz concentration camp, whose prisoners we will meet again before this story is over. Into the ravine, over the following 2 years, went Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, psychiatric patients, Ukrainian nationalists when the occupiers turned on them too, hostages, resistors, anyone the regime chose to destroy. By the time the city was liberated, the total number murdered at that one site is estimated at somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 human beings. The Jews of Kiev were its first and largest group of victims, but the ravine held a cross-section of everyone the occupation deemed disposable. And Kiev was not an exception, it was a template. What the capital experienced in September, the other cities of eastern and southern Ukraine experienced through the autumn, one after another, as the front rolled over them, with a regularity that is almost harder to absorb than any single massacre. Historians sometimes call those months the Autumn of Ravines, because nearly every major city in the path of the advance acquired its own Babyn Yar, its own pit on the outskirts, with its own date and its own number. Dnipropetrovsk, the great industrial city on the bend of the Dnieper River. In the middle of October 1941, its remaining Jews were assembled at a downtown department store and marched in groups to a ravine at the edge of the city, where over 2 to 3 days in mid-October, security police and a police battalion shot at least 10,000 people, with some accounts putting the figure closer to 15,000. Mariupol, the steel port on the Sea of Azov, taken in early October, before the month was out, on the 20th and 21st of October, a detachment of Einsatzgruppe D shot roughly 8,000 Jews outside the city, and within weeks the occupation authorities declared the city free of Jews, a phrase they used in their documents with the satisfaction of an administrative milestone. Rivne, in the northwest, which the Germans had made the administrative capital of their civil occupation regime in Ukraine. In early November, most of the city's Jewish population, 17,000 people and more by most reckonings, those without work permits, were marched out to the Sosenki pine forest and shot over 2 days and a night in prepared pits among the trees. The city that housed the occupation government of all Ukraine thus destroyed its own Jewish community within weeks of settling in, as if to demonstrate from headquarters what the policy now was everywhere. And between these names that at least appear in the histories, the same happened at 100 smaller places that mostly do not. District towns of 500 Jews, of 2,000, of 800, each with a morning of assembly, a road out of town, and a pit. By the turn of the year, barely 6 months into the invasion, the number of Jews murdered in the occupied Soviet territories had already passed the 500,000 mark, a great share of them in Ukraine. Nothing on that scale, at that speed, had ever happened in Europe before, and the men running it were just getting organized. To understand the Holocaust in Ukraine, though, you cannot stay with the big cities and the 5-figure massacres. You have to look at how the machine worked in the small places where there were no reporters, no famous ravines, and no one left to write memoirs. Here is the scene, assembled from thousands of witness accounts gathered across Ukraine over the last decades. It is a composite, but it repeats, with local variations, in village after village, because the procedure was standardized. A detachment arrives in a district town, sometimes a few dozen men, sometimes fewer. Orders are posted. The Jews of the town are to assemble on a given morning at the square or the school or the synagogue for registration or resettlement or a labor assignment. The language is always administrative. In the preceding days, local men have been requisitioned with shovels to dig what they are told are defense works or storage pits, somewhere just outside town, at the edge of a forest, along a ravine, beside the old quarry. Carts are requisitioned, too, to carry the luggage, and sometimes to carry the elderly who cannot walk the distance. On the morning itself, the column forms. It moves out of town along a road everyone knows, past houses whose windows are full of faces. At the pit, the process runs exactly as it ran at Babyn Yar, in miniature. Belongings here, clothes there, groups of 10 or 20 forward. The shooters are sometimes drunk by afternoon. The shooting can be heard in the town, and it goes on for hours, and the townspeople stand in their gardens and listen. In the evening, the pit is covered, thinly. Witnesses in village after village, interviewed decades later as old men and women, remembered as children seeing the ground move for days. I include that detail, and only that one, because it appears so consistently across so many independent testimonies that it has become part of the historical record itself, the signature fact of the Holocaust by bullets. The graves were shallow, the killing was hasty, and the earth itself would not lie still. Now to the question I promised we would face honestly. Who did all this? The trigger men at the big city massacres were overwhelmingly Germans, SS men, security police, and members of ordinary German police battalions, a fact worth pausing on by itself, because most of those policemen were not fanatics hand-picked for murder. They were middle-aged reservists, and with vanishingly few exceptions they did the work. But the machine had many more parts than triggers. Across occupied Ukraine, the Germans recruited an auxiliary police from the local population, and those auxiliaries served the killing operations in roles that were absolutely essential to them: guarding ghettos, delivering orders, rounding up families house by house, escorting the columns, cordoning the pits, hunting down those who hid. In some actions, especially as the war went on, auxiliaries also shot. There were tens of thousands of such men across the occupied East. Their motives ran the whole shabby human range: ideology in some, hatred of the Soviet regime spilling onto its imagined Jewish accomplices, greed for the property of the dead, fear, opportunism, the simple gravity of a paycheck and a uniform in a starving country. And all around the machine stood the witnesses. This is perhaps the deepest difference between the camp Holocaust and the bullet Holocaust. Auschwitz was designed to be unseen, hidden behind wire and forests and euphemism. The shootings in Ukraine were seen by everyone. The columns walked down main streets at noon. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary people watched their neighbors walk by, schoolmates, customers, midwives who had delivered their children, and then heard the guns, and then, in the weeks after, saw the clothes of the dead sold or distributed, saw new occupants move into the emptied houses. Some watched with satisfaction. Many watched in terror, knowing that helping meant death, and death not only for you, but for your family. Some, and we will meet them soon, decided to help anyway. And the requisitions went further than shovels and carts. When the witnesses finally began to talk, decades later, They described how the killing detachments drafted the ordinary life of the village into the operation. Women ordered to cook for the shooters, teenagers ordered to mend the sacks, to gather and sort the clothing, to press down the earth. Boys sent afterward to collect the spent cartridge cases from the grass. A mass shooting, it turns out, was not only a crime committed in front of a community, it was a crime the community was conscripted to cater, a fact that helps explain both why the memory of it ran so deep and why, under the post-war silence, it stayed buried so long. Guilt, fear, and grief were all tangled in the same knot. Decades later, a French Catholic priest named Patrick Desbois began traveling through the villages of Ukraine with interpreters and a camera, knocking on doors, asking the very old a simple question: "Do you remember what happened to the Jews here?" Desbois had come to this work by a road of his own. His grandfather had been a French prisoner of war held by the Germans at a camp at Rava on the edge of Galicia, and had spoken of the place only in fragments. And the grandson went looking for what the old man would not say, and found, all around that camp, the unmarked graves of an entire murdered people. It turned out that the old villagers remembered everything. They had been children at the fences and the roadsides, and no one had ever asked them before. Village by village, his teams recorded thousands of testimonies and, guided by them, located mass grave after mass grave that appeared in no registry, correlating the accounts with wartime documents and with the German cartridge cases still lying in the soil. His organization has documented thousands of execution sites across the lands of the former Soviet Union, and the work is not finished. Think about what that means. Well into the 21st century, the largest crime scene in Europe was still being mapped, one elderly memory at a time. It is worth pausing to notice how we know all of this, because the knowing is itself part of the story. For the Holocaust in Ukraine, the evidence comes at us from three independent directions that lock together like the legs of a tripod. The perpetrators' own reports, written at the time, boasting in numbers. The Soviet investigative commissions, which exhumed and photographed and deposed witnesses within months of liberation, whatever the state later chose to do with the findings, and the living memory of the bystanders and the survivors, gathered across 80 years from the trials of the 1940s to the village interviews of our own century. Each of these sources has its flaws, and historians weigh them carefully. But where all three agree, and on the central facts of this story they agree everywhere, you are standing on some of the most solidly documented ground in all of modern history. I say this plainly because this particular history attracts deniers the way a wound attracts flies, and the answer to them is not outrage, it is the tripod. Their own paperwork convicts them. If you find that this history deserves the length we are giving it tonight, and these long, unhurried evenings are something you want more of, take a moment to subscribe, and the next one will find you on its own. Now let us go south, to the sea, because one of the most terrible chapters of this story was not written by Germany at all. When we picture the Holocaust, we picture Germans, but in the south of Ukraine, between the Dniester and the Bug rivers, the occupying power was Romania, Germany's ally, and what Romania did in that zone forms one of the least taught chapters of the entire Second World War. Among Germany's partners, Romania holds a distinction that its own official history commission would confirm 6 decades later. No ally of the German state murdered more Jews on its own initiative. Romania entered the war against the Soviet Union alongside Germany in June 1941, retaking provinces it had lost the year before and receiving from Germany, as a reward, the administration of a broad slice of southern Ukraine, which the Romanians named Transnistria. The great prize of the region was Odessa, the legendary Black Sea port, a city entwined with Jewish history for more than a century. Odessa held out under siege for 2 months, and its resistance cost the Romanian army dearly. When the city finally fell, on October 16, 1941, tens of thousands of Jews remained inside it. 6 days later, on October 22nd, a delayed mine, planted by the retreating Soviets exactly as in Kiev, exploded under the building on Maraslievskaya Street where the Romanian military command had installed itself, killing dozens, including the city's Romanian commandant and other officers. The response was not an investigation. It was an order for reprisals against the city's Jews, and what followed over the next days, October 22nd to 24th, was a massacre carried out with a savagery that shocked even hardened observers. Jews were seized in the streets and in their homes. Thousands were hanged or shot in public. Thousands more were forced into warehouses at the edge of the city, which were then machine-gunned and set on fire. Buildings full of living people burned. The most careful estimates place the dead of those days in Odessa between 25,000 and 34,000 human beings. I am not going to describe it more closely than that, out of respect for the dead. The numbers alone say what kind of event this was, and it was only the beginning of the Transnistrian catastrophe. In the second week of January 1942, the roughly 40,000 Jews still alive in Odessa were ordered into a makeshift ghetto in the Slobodka district, in buildings without heat, in the depth of a Black Sea winter, and many of the oldest and frailest died within days in the open cold. Then, from the middle of January into February, close to 20,000 of them were loaded into unheated trains and cattle cars, hauled north into the Transnistrian interior, and driven from the railheads on foot toward camps and holding sites whose names deserve to be far better known than they are: Bogdanovka, Domenivka, Akhmeketka, the Golta district. People died in the cars and died on the marches, and the roadsides of that winter became a graveyard without markers. The camps at the end of those roads were not labor camps in any meaningful sense. They were pens for dying. At Bogdanovka, on the Bug River, tens of thousands of Jews had already been concentrated by December of 1941, and then, between late December and the middle of January, in an operation involving Romanian gendarmes, Ukrainian auxiliary police, and local ethnic German militia, virtually all of them were shot. Tens of thousands of people, with estimates for Bogdanovka alone running from 40,000 to more than 50,000. In January and February of 1942, thousands upon thousands more were murdered at Domenivka and Akhmeketka. Through the first half of that year, ethnic German militia units in the region shot tens of thousands of the deportees from Odessa in their turn. And over it all lay typhus, which in the crowded, starving camps of Transnistria killed on a scale that rivaled the bullets. Across the Romanian zone as a whole, deaths from shooting, typhus, starvation, and exposure ran into the hundreds of thousands. Romania's own International Historical Commission, decades later, concluded that between 280,000 and 380,000 Jews died in the territories under Romanian responsibility during the war, the greater part of them in Transnistria. Pause on what this means for the shape of the whole story. In the schoolbook version, the Holocaust is a German crime, full stop. The Romanian zone shows something more uncomfortable, that the German project created a weather system in which other states, with their own anti-Semitic movements and their own scores to settle, launched mass murder campaigns of their own, under their own flags, with their own soldiers. History does not get simpler the closer you look at it. It gets darker and more crowded. There is a strange coda to the Romanian chapter, and it complicates the story in a way worth sitting with. From late 1942 onward, as the war turned, the Romanian government changed course. Deportations slowed and stopped. Some survivors were eventually allowed back, and Romania refused, in the end, to hand its remaining Jewish population over to the German death camps. Calculation, not conscience, is the explanation most historians give, a government hedging its bets as defeat loomed. Whatever the motive, the result was that hundreds of thousands of Jews under Romanian rule survived the war, even as hundreds of thousands of others had been destroyed by the same state's own hand. After the war, a people's tribunal in Bucharest tried the wartime leadership. Marshal Ion Antonescu, the ruler of wartime Romania, the governor of Transnistria Gheorghe Alexianu, and the general whose troops carried out the Odessa reprisals, Nicolae Machici, were all sentenced to death for these crimes. Antonescu and Alexianu were executed by firing squad at a prison outside Bucharest on the 1st of June, 1946, while Machici's sentence was commuted and he died in prison. It is one of the few chapters of this whole story that ends with the men responsible standing before a court while the memory of their victims was still fresh. And even so, you will search most classrooms of the world in vain for a single mention of what Romania did between the Dniester and the Bug. Meanwhile, in the German zone, the war against the Jews had entered its second year, and its second, even more systematic phase. There is a misconception that the shooting Holocaust was a phenomenon of 1941 only, a spasm of the invasion's first months. The record says otherwise. Some of the largest massacres came later, and the year 1942, the year the death camps in Poland came fully online, was also the deadliest year in many regions of occupied Ukraine. Consider Kharkiv in the Far East, the second city of Soviet Ukraine. The Germans took it in late October 1941. In December, the city's remaining Jews, about 15,000 or more, were ordered into a barrack settlement at the edge of town at a tractor factory and held there through weeks of deepening winter. Then, beginning in mid-December and continuing into January, they were taken in groups to a ravine outside the city called Babyn Yar and shot in temperatures far below freezing. Estimates for the site run to 15,000 and beyond. The pattern of Kiev had repeated at the other end of the country, the same ravine geometry, the same ledger arithmetic, this time in snow. Around the same time, the machinery acquired a new instrument. Beginning that winter, the killing squads in the occupied Soviet territories received specially built vans whose sealed cargo compartments were fed with the engine's exhaust. The victims, loaded in under the pretense of transport, were dead by the end of a short drive. Tens of thousands of people were murdered in these gas vans across the occupied East. The vans mattered less for their numbers, which the bullets always exceeded, than for what they signified. The regime was engineering the murder process itself, studying it, optimizing it, moving deliberately toward the stationary gas chambers then under construction in occupied Poland. The Holocaust by bullets and the Holocaust of the camps were not two separate stories. One flowed directly into the other, and men who learned their trade in the ravines of Ukraine carried it west into the camp system. Then came the second sweep. In the western regions, the Germans had, unusually for occupied Soviet territory, herded surviving Jews into ghettos rather than killing them outright in the first months. In Volhynia and Galicia especially, regions with old, enormous Jewish populations. Through 1942, those ghettos were liquidated, one after another, with a thoroughness that beggars belief. In the region of Western Volhynia alone, the second wave, from May to October of 1942, took on the order of 160,000 lives. The city of Lutsk, around 14,700 in the second half of August. Volodymyr Volynski, around 13,500 in early September. Lubomlin, around 10,000 at the start of October. And these are only the largest entries in a list that runs on and on, name after name, town after town, each of them the end of a community that had existed for centuries. Galicia, in the far west, adds one more chapter to the anatomy of the crime, because Galicia is where the bullet Holocaust and the camp Holocaust visibly joined hands. The Germans had attached this region to their administration of occupied Poland, and so its Jews were pulled into the machinery built for Polish Jewry. Beginning in the spring of 1942, trains began leaving Lviv for a place called Belzec, one of the first pure extermination camps, where the gas chambers were stationary and the arithmetic was even colder than the ravines. Some 15,000 Jews from Lviv were deported to Belzec around March. In August came what survivors called the Great Action, when in 3 weeks of roundups on the order of 40 to 50,000 Lviv Jews were seized and sent to the same destination. In the city itself stood the Janowska camp, part factory, part transit station, part killing ground, through which enormous numbers of Galician Jews passed on their way to death, and where thousands upon thousands were shot on the spot in the sands beside the camp. When the Lviv ghetto was finally destroyed in June of 1943, thousands were killed in the streets and cellars during the liquidation itself, and the survivors were marched to Janowska. Of one of the largest Jewish cities of pre-war Europe, only scattered handfuls in hiding remained. One more group belongs in this chapter, because their fate is even less taught than the rest. Among the millions of Red Army soldiers who fell into German captivity, there were large numbers of Jewish servicemen, and for them capture was a death sentence of its own. At the prisoner of war camps, the Germans screened the columns, with informers and physical inspections, pulling out those identified as Jews and as political officers, and shot them, tens of thousands of Jewish soldiers, murdered not on a battlefield but in captivity, under standing written orders that marked them out from the other prisoners. The prisoner of war camps in Ukraine were themselves a vast atrocity, in which Soviet captives of every background died of starvation and exposure in numbers that stagger comprehension, and within that catastrophe the Jewish prisoners were a group marked for immediate killing. When people ask why so few Jewish men survived to tell what happened in the East, part of the answer lies here. By the end of 1943, Jewish Ukraine, as a living world, had effectively ceased to exist. The shtetl civilization of the western provinces, the great urban communities of Kiev and Kharkiv and Odessa, 1,000 years of accumulated life, had been reduced to hiding places, forest camps, and graves. When you read that roughly 1.5 million Jews died in Ukraine, understand that the number is not only a count of persons, it is the extinction of a whole human world, its languages, its music, its schools of thought, its unwritten books, its unborn generations, and yet, even inside that darkness, there were people who refused it. The story is not complete and not honest without them. Everything in occupied Ukraine was arranged to make rescue irrational. The penalty for hiding a Jew was death, and the occupiers made a point of advertising that the penalty extended to the rescuer's family. Denunciation was rewarded, food was rationed to the edge of starvation, so an extra hidden mouth was itself a mortal risk. and a rescuer had to sustain the effort not for a night but for months, sometimes years, against searches, informers, and sheer exhaustion. Under those conditions, the astonishing thing is not how few helped, it is that so many did. As of the most recent counts, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, has recognized more than 2,600 Ukrainians as righteous among the nations, individuals documented to have risked their lives to save Jews without reward. Behind that official number stands a larger uncounted reality, historians agree, because recognition requires surviving witnesses and paperwork, and many rescues ended with everyone involved dead, or were simply never recorded. Who were they? Peasant families who dug hiding pits under barns and fed people out of their own hunger for 2 winters. Priests and nuns who produced false baptismal certificates. Doctors who hid patients in infectious disease wards where Germans feared to walk. Neighbors who took in children overnight and then kept them and raised them, and in some cases only told them the truth decades later. One case deserves special mention precisely because it remains unresolved to this day. In Lviv, the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, an old and ailing man and by far the most influential Ukrainian religious figure of his time, ordered his monasteries and convents to hide Jews, above all children. More than 150 Jewish children and adults were sheltered in that network, and the survivors spent the rest of their lives testifying to it. His brother, the abbot Clemente Sheptytsky, and the nun Olena Vitter, who ran the operation on his instructions, were both recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. The Metropolitan himself never has been, despite more than 60 years of petitions, because his record also contains public gestures of welcome toward the German invaders in the first days, when many in his position saw them as liberation from Soviet terror, and the recognition committees have judged, again and again, that the file is too mixed. I am not going to hand you a verdict on him. I will only say that his case holds, in one human life, the whole tangled truth of this land under occupation, where the same society produced men who joined the killing, men who looked away, and men who saved children while writing letters of protest to Berlin itself, and where one person could, over 3 terrible years, be more than one of those things. Among those the network saved was a rabbi named David Kahane, hidden within the Metropolitan's own residence and the monasteries of his church while the city outside was emptied of his people. Kahane survived, wrote one of the essential diaries of the Lviv catastrophe, and went on, in one of history's quiet ironies, to serve as chief rabbi of the Air Force of the new State of Israel. When he and other survivors spent the rest of their lives petitioning on behalf of the man who had hidden them, they were not naive about the complexities. They simply insisted on the part of the record they had lived. There was Jewish resistance too, though the school books rarely reach it. Jews fought in the Soviet partisan movement in significant numbers, and tens of thousands of Jews across the occupied East reached the forests. In the wooded swamps of the Northwest, family camps formed, armed groups sheltering women, children, and the elderly in the deep woods by the hundreds, raided and hunted through 2 winters and, in a remarkable number of cases, surviving to liberation. In several ghettos of the western regions there were uprisings and mass breakouts in the final hours, desperate, mostly doomed, and real. And beyond the armed resistance lay the vast, quieter resistance of survival itself, the false papers, the Aryan side existences held together by nerve and luck, The children passed to neighbors and convents under new names, the pits under barn floors where families lay for a year and more. Every Jewish life that came out of occupied Ukraine alive came out through some chain of these acts, link after link, any one of which could have broken. The image of passive victims walking quietly is one more piece of the story that dissolves when you actually look. People resisted at every stage, with weapons where they had them and where they had none, with forged papers, with bribes, with flight, with the sheer stubborn act of keeping a child alive one more day. By late 1943, the Red Army was driving west, and the perpetrators in Ukraine turned to a task that tells you they understood their own guilt with perfect clarity. They set out to make the evidence disappear. In the summer of 1942, the German security apparatus created one of the most secret programs of the entire war, a project designated Sonderaktion 1005. Its assignment was simple to state and monstrous to contemplate. Wherever the mass graves of the East lay, they were to be opened and the bodies were to be burned until no proof remained of what had been done. The officer placed in charge of developing the methods was a man we have already met, Paul Blobel, the same colonel whose unit had carried out the Babyn Yar massacre. The man who filled the ravine was sent back to empty it. In the summer of 1943, with the front collapsing toward the Dnieper River, Blobel came to Kiev to oversee the erasure of the very crime he had committed 2 years earlier. The labor was forced on prisoners from the Sirets concentration camp beside the ravine, a place that was itself a byword for cruelty even by the standards of that time and place, where inmates were starved, worked to death, and shot at the whim of a notoriously brutal commandant. From among its prisoners, more than 300 men, many of them Jewish, were selected for the ravine work, kept fenced off from the world in an earthen dugout at the site, in chains, some fitted with leg irons. Through August and September of 1943, these prisoners were made to dig open the ravine floor, to build enormous pyres out of railway rails and wood, layering the exhumed dead with fuel, and to burn them, day after day, week after week. Even the gravestones of the city's Jewish cemetery were taken to line the firebeds. The ash was crushed and scattered over the surrounding fields. The prisoners understood with complete clarity what would happen to them when the work was finished, because they were the last witnesses, and the entire point of the operation was that there should be no witnesses. So they decided to get out. For weeks, working at night in the dugout where they were held, they prepared, hiding tools and scraps of metal, and they managed to get hold of a rusted pair of scissors and a key that fit the lock, and with these they slowly worked their shackles open. At dawn on September 29, 1943, 2 years to the day after the Great Massacre, the prisoners, 327 of them, rushed the guards and broke for the darkness in a mass escape. The machine guns caught most of them, but not all. The accounts count between a dozen and 18 survivors of that morning, men who lived to see the city liberated 6 weeks later, and their testimony, the testimony of men forced to handle the evidence of the crime with their own hands, became some of the most devastating ever recorded about the Holocaust in the East. The erasure operation itself had failed in the only way that mattered. The Germans burned the bodies, but the truth walked out of the ravine on its own feet. On November 6, 1943, the Red Army retook Kyiv. Soviet investigators of the Extraordinary State Commission documented the sites, photographed the ash fields, took depositions. At the post-war trial of German personnel in Kyiv in January 1946, Dina Pronikeva, the puppet theater actress who had climbed out of the ravine, gave her testimony in open court. Further west, at Nuremberg, The Einsatzgruppen themselves went on trial before an American military tribunal in 1947, 24 commanders and officers, in what the chief prosecutor called the biggest murder trial in history. That chief prosecutor, remarkably, was 27 years old, a young army investigator named Benjamin Ferenc, who had walked the liberated camps as a soldier, and this was the first case he had ever tried in his life. He barely needed witnesses. The prosecution's central evidence was the unit's own reports, that meticulous ledger of massacres, including the Babyn Yar figure of 33,771, read back to the men who had signed it. 14 of the defendants were sentenced to death, though in the political climate of the early Cold War most sentences were later commuted, and in the end 4 were executed. One of the 4 was Paul Blobel, hanged at Landsberg prison in June of 1951. You might think the story ends there, with liberation, trials, and at least a fraction of justice. It does not, because now begins the strangest chapter of all, the one that explains the second half of our title. The killing was over. The forgetting was about to be organized. While the war still raged, Soviet Jewish writers had begun assembling the record. 2 of the most famous correspondents in the Soviet Union, Ilya Ehrenberg and Vasily Grossman, both of them Jews from Ukraine by birth, gathered testimony from survivors, soldiers, and witnesses into a massive documentary volume called The Black Book, a full accounting of the German murder of Soviet Jews, community by community. Grossman himself had reached the sites early, walking the ash fields, interviewing survivors while the front was still moving, writing some of the first great documentary prose of the Holocaust. The Black Book was typeset in Moscow in the years just after the war. It was never published there. In 1948, the Soviet authorities destroyed the entire edition, the print run, the plates, the typefaces, the book's insistence that Jews had been murdered as Jews, and its plain documentation that some local collaborators had helped, did not fit the state's preferred story, in which all Soviet peoples had suffered together and questions of collaboration were closed. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, under whose auspices the book had been compiled, was dissolved, its leading members arrested, and in August of 1952, 13 of them, poets, writers, public figures, were executed in the basement of a Moscow prison on a night remembered as the Night of the Murdered Poets. The men and women who had tried to write the memory down were killed by the state they had served, 7 years after the war against fascism was won. From then on, a policy hardened across the Soviet Union that historians describe with a chilling phrase, the nationalization of the dead. The victims of the German occupation were to be remembered in one category only, peaceful Soviet citizens. That the Jews among them had been singled out, hunted as a people, murdered to the last infant where the killers could reach them, this was not to be said in public. It was never quite denied. It was simply dissolved, generalized, buried in the passive voice, and the silence was enforced from above at the very moment it was hardening from below, because the last years of Stalin's rule brought an official anti-Semitic campaign of its own, the press crusade against so-called rootless cosmopolitans, the purge of Jewish names from cultural life, and finally, in early 1953, the fabricated doctor's plot, in which Jewish physicians were publicly accused of conspiring to murder Soviet leaders. Survivors of the ravines, people who had lost entire families, learned to say nothing at work and eventually to say nothing at home. There are children of survivors who grew up in post-war Kiev and learned only as adults, sometimes only after emigrating, what had happened to their own grandparents and where. No monument marked Babyn Yar. The ravine itself was treated as a nuisance of urban geography. City planners filled it with liquid waste pumped from nearby brick factories, year after year, behind an earthen dam, literally burying the burial ground. And then the ground answered. On the morning of March 13, 1961, after weeks of thaw, the dam failed, and a wall of liquefied mud burst out of Babyn Yar and swept down into the Korinovka district below, burying streets, houses, a tram depot, people on their morning commute. The official death toll was 145, and almost no one, then or now, believes it. Independent estimates of the dead run far higher, into the many hundreds and beyond, and the disaster was smothered in censorship for years. In Kyiv, people spoke of it in low voices with a phrase that needs no explanation: Babyn Yar takes its revenge. Even as a hole in the ground, the place refused to be erased. And, since a year, the silence cracked from another direction. A 28-year-old Russian poet named Yevgeny Yevtushenko stood at the ravine, saw wasteland and garbage where tens of thousands of murdered people lay, and wrote a poem that begins with one of the most famous opening lines of the 20th century: "Over Babyn Yar there are no monuments." Its publication in a Moscow literary newspaper in September 1961 was a 9/11 earthquake. The poem said, in print in the Soviet Union, that the victims were Jews, that anti-Semitism was not only a fascist disease, and that the silence itself was a form of desecration. It made the young poet world-famous overnight, and it drew down official fury. The composer Dmitri Shostakovich set the poem as the opening movement of his 13th symphony, and the authorities pressured performers, demanded revised lyrics, and let the work fall under an unofficial shadow after its premiere. A poem and a symphony had become threats to the state, which tells you precisely how much power the buried truth still held.
Then came the witness in prose.
A Kiev writer named Anatoly Kuznetsov had lived beside Babyn Yar as a 12-year-old boy during the occupation, had heard the machine guns from his own yard, and had written it all down in a school notebook. His documentary novel, Babyn Yar, appeared in a Soviet literary magazine in 1966, and it was published only after the censors had cut it by roughly a quarter, softening exactly the passages you would expect, the ones about the specifically Jewish identity of the victims and the uncomfortable behavior of some locals. 3 years later, in 1969, Kuznetsov defected to Britain, carrying photographic film of his complete uncensored manuscript hidden in the lining of his clothes. The full text, published in the West, printed the censored passages in distinct type so that readers could see with their own eyes not only what had happened at the ravine, but what the Soviet state had tried to remove from the record. The book is thus a double document, a testimony of the massacre and a testimony of the silencing. Kuznetsov himself never went home. He lived out his remaining years in London and died there in 1979. Still a young man, the boy from beside the ravine who had, in the end, outwritten an empire's censors, and the people themselves began to defy the silence with their feet. On September 29, 1966, the 25th anniversary of the massacre, several thousand people gathered at the ravine without permission, without an official program, simply because they refused to let the day pass unmarked. Jews stood alongside Ukrainian writers and intellectuals who had come deliberately, as Ukrainians, to stand with them, among them the war novelist Viktor Nekrasov and a young literary critic named Ivan Juba, who stepped forward and gave an improvised speech that people would copy and pass from hand to hand in the underground press for decades. He named anti-Semitism as a disease his own society still carried, and he called Jews and Ukrainians to see each other's tragedies as their own. The reward for the speakers was KGB surveillance and years of persecution, but something had shifted that day at the edge of the ravine, a first public rehearsal of a different kind of memory, and the anniversary gatherings never fully stopped again. Under that kind of pressure, the state finally conceded a monument. It went up in 1976, a large bronze group in the heroic Soviet style, dedicated to the Soviet citizens and prisoners of war shot at Babyn Yar. The inscription did not contain the word Jew. Visitors from abroad would stand before it, knowing what the site was, reading an inscription that could not say it. Only in 1991, 50 years after the massacre, with the Soviet Union in its final months, was a menorah-shaped memorial raised near the ravine specifically for the Jewish dead. Independent Ukraine, in the decades since, has slowly opened the whole subject: the commemorations, the archives, the research centers, the naming of the victims one by one, work that continues right now, and that work has been wounded again by war in our own time. In the opening days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a missile strike hit the television tower that stands directly beside the Babyn Yar site, killing civilians at the edge of the old killing ground, and the news that war had returned to that exact patch of earth went around the world as a kind of grim shorthand. Even now, the ravine cannot seem to rest. Which brings us, finally, to the question hiding inside the title of this video. Why did the school books pass over all of this? You can now assemble the answer yourself, because it happened in territory that fell behind the Iron Curtain, beyond the reach of Western memory culture, because its survivors were few, and those few lived in a state where speaking was dangerous, because the perpetrators burned the physical evidence and the liberating state buried the testimony, because there was no single cinematic site, no gate, no barracks to photograph, only grass over ravines. The Holocaust of the camps produced survivors who wrote the books the world read. The Holocaust by bullets consumed its witnesses almost whole, and the state that inherited the graves preferred them silent. What we did not learn in school was not unknowable, it was unspoken. So let us end by speaking it plainly one more time. Between 1941 and 1944, on the territory of present-day Ukraine, the German occupiers, their allies, and their local helpers murdered approximately 1.5 million Jewish men, women, and children by shooting more than by any other means near the towns where they lived, one community at a time. It was a quarter of the entire Holocaust. It was the first act of the entire Holocaust, and for 2 generations afterward, the state that ruled those lands worked to keep the specific truth of it out of public memory, so that the victims were murdered once by bullets and then again by category. Against all of that, remembering is not a small or sentimental act. It is the thing both sets of barriers were trying to prevent. The recovery is real, and it is ongoing. The witness interviews continue while the last witnesses live. In Jerusalem, the central database of Holocaust victims' names has grown, testimony page by testimony page, archive by archive, to millions of individual recorded names, and the researchers say that the hardest region to complete, the region where whole families vanished with no one left to fill out a page, is exactly the one we have spent tonight in, the lands of the shootings. Every year the lists grow anyway, out of Soviet files, German files, memorial, books, the memories of the dying, name by recovered name, which is the exact reversal of what the ledgers of 1941 intended. A number was supposed to be all that remained. Instead, the numbers are slowly turning back into people. If somewhere in this long evening you met a place you had never heard of before, Kamyanets Podilsky, Bogdanovka, Babyn Yar, Sosenki, I would ask you to do one small thing before you sleep. Write its name in the comments. Nothing more than that. A place that people still bother to name is a place that has not been successfully erased. And tonight, that is the only defeat we can still hand the men who dug the pits and the men who ordered the silence. I'm Arthur. May the ones you love be near you, and may your night be a peaceful one. That is all the sermon I have. Good night.